The year was 1885, and in the Arizona Territory, the dust was a living thing. It coated the sills of St. Jude's orphanage for girls with a fine red powder, settled in the folds of their grey wool frocks, and worked its way into the lungs until every breath felt gritty. For Esther, the dust was the taste of loneliness. At 17, she had been at St. Jude's for nearly a decade, long enough for the memories of her parents to become thin and fragile, like pressed flowers in a forgotten book. What remained of them was a hollow ache in her chest and a small, leather-bound journal filled with her mother's delicate sketches of desert flora. Life within the orphanage's adobe walls was a landscape of its own, as stark and unforgiving as the mesas that stood sentinel on the horizon. The days were measured by the sharp clap of Matron Shaw's hands, a sound that could curdle milk. The routine was a relentless metronome of chores, prayers, and thinly veiled contempt. The matron, a woman whose charity had long since soured into resentment, saw the girls not as souls to be nurtured, but as burdens to be managed. Esther, with her quiet nature and eyes that seemed to hold the vast, sorrowful expanse of the sky, was a particular target for the matron's sharp-edged words. She was too quiet, too distant, a constant, silent accusation of a world that had failed her. Her stasis was a carefully constructed fortress of silence. She performed her duties with a mechanical precision that offered no purchase for criticism, her movements economical and her face a mask of placid obedience. Inside, however, she lived in the world her mother had drawn. She memorized the names of plants, the stubborn creosote, the night-blooming cereus, the datura with its poisonous beauty. The book was her only inheritance, a testament to a life that had once held gentleness and wonder. It was a private language, a secret garden cultivated in the barren soil of her existence. This quiet resignation was her shield, a way to endure the unendurable until the day she turned 18 and would be cast out into the world, a prospect that was both a terror and a sliver of hope. The punishment that set everything in motion was for an offense so minor it was barely real. A dropped spoon during the evening meal, clattering on the stone floor like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Matron Shaw's eyes, small and hard as river pebbles, had fixed on her. The sentence was not the switch, but something worse in that parched land, a long walk. Esther was to fetch water from the old willow spring, a 2-mile trek into the arid wilderness, a task designed to exhaust and isolate. She set out just after dawn, 2 heavy wooden buckets chafing her hands, the sun already a hot weight on her shoulders. The landscape was a study in beige and ochre, the earth cracked and thirsty. She walked along the bed of a dry arroyo, its sandy bottom a pale ribbon winding through the scrub. The silence here was different from the silence of the orphanage. It was vast and alive, humming with the unseen life of the desert. It did not press down, it expanded, making her feel both infinitesimally small and strangely free. It was a sound that broke the stillness, so faint at first she thought it was a bird. A low, guttural moan, like the earth itself was in pain. It came again, closer this time, from around a bend in the arroyo where a cluster of tamarisk grew thick and green, signaling the presence of underground moisture. Caution was stitched into the very fabric of an orphan's soul. The world was filled with dangers, and Matron Shaw's dire warnings about the Navajo, whom she called godless savages, echoed in her mind. But the sound was one of pure desperation, a note of suffering that bypassed prejudice and went straight to the heart. Esther set down the heavy buckets, her hands raw and red. She moved forward slowly, her worn boots making no sound in the soft sand. As she rounded the bend, she saw him. An old Navajo man was sunk to his chest in a patch of wet, shimmering sand. It was Quicksand, a hidden trap fed by the same subterranean seep that nourished the tamarisk. His face, a beautiful topography of deep-hewn lines, was contorted with exhaustion. His eyes were closed, his silver hair matted with sweat and sand. He was no longer struggling, a sign he had given up hope. For a long moment, Esther was frozen by a fear colder than any winter night at the orphanage. Every instinct screamed at her to run back to the sterile safety of Sententa Bleng. Every Deus motria basses nos, G's night is nine. Jude's, back to the predictable cruelty of the matron. To help this man was to invite a wrath she could not fathom. He was everything she had been taught to fear and despise. But as she looked at him, sinking slowly into the earth, she did not see a savage. She saw a human being at the precipice of death, his quiet surrender a mirror of the despair she knew so well. In that moment, the world of Matron Shaw and her bitter rules fell away, leaving only the sun, the sand, and a life that needed saving. The initial moments were a frantic, silent ballet of desperation. Words were useless. The old man, whose name she would later learn was Hosteen, watched her with weary, half-open eyes, his breathing shallow. Esther's mind raced, not with the matron's catechisms, but with the practical, earthy knowledge from her mother's book. Not the flowers, but the roots. The way a mesquite's roots anchored it deep in the ground, a lesson in leverage and stability. Her eyes scanned the arroyo. A deadfall of sun-bleached cottonwood lay 50 yards away, its branches brittle but long. She scrambled over the rocks, her hands grabbing at a thick, sturdy limb. It was heavy, almost too much for her to drag, the rough bark tearing at her palms. She grunted with the effort, hauling it back to the edge of the quicksand, her own breath coming in ragged bursts. She was no longer a frail orphan, she was a force of will, fueled by a sudden, fierce determination. "Here," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. She pushed the branch out over the sand, nudging it toward his hands. Hosteen's eyes opened fully. They held no surprise, only a flicker of something ancient and knowing. He gathered the last of his strength, his gnarled fingers closing around the wood. He was too weak to pull himself, his body a dead weight in the sucking mire. Esther lay flat on the stable ground, spreading her weight as she had seen animals do near uncertain waterholes. She dug her fingers into the dry earth, finding purchase, and began to pull. It was a grueling, torturous process. The sand fought her, a greedy mouth unwilling to release its meal. Her muscles screamed, her shoulders felt as if they were being torn from their sockets. Sweat stung her eyes, mingling with the dust on her face to create streaks of mud like war paint. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The branch creaked, and she feared it would snap. Hosteen's grip faltered. She could see the life draining from his face. "No," Esther said, the word a raw command. "Hold on." She repositioned her grip, her mind going back to a drawing in her mother's book, a diagram of a simple lever. She shifted her weight, using a rock as a fulcrum, and pulled not with her arms, but with her entire body, a slow, rhythmic heave. Inch by agonizing inch, the sand began to yield. A horrible slurping sound broke the silence as the seal was broken. He was moving. Hope, bright and sharp, surged through her. With a final, desperate cry that was torn from the deepest part of her, she hauled him clear. He collapsed onto the solid bank, a heap of wet sand and bone-deep weariness, gasping for air. Esther scrambled to his side, her own body trembling with exertion. She uncorked her water canteen, the one she carried for herself, and lifted his head gently, letting the precious liquid trickle past his lips. He drank greedily, his Adam's apple bobbing. When he had taken his fill, he sagged back against the ground, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Life was returning. He lay there for a long time, recovering his strength while Esther sat beside him, the abandoned water buckets forgotten. The silence between them was no longer tense, but filled with a profound, unspoken gratitude. Finally, he sat up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at her, and his eyes were not just thankful. They were searching, analytical, as if he were reading the story of her soul. His gaze fell upon her dress. It was a plain, grey thing, patched and faded, but on the hem of the sleeve, her mother had stitched a small, intricate pattern of beads, 4 triangles pointing inward to a central circle. She had told Esther it was a pattern of protection given to her by a kind Navajo woman who had helped her when she was lost long ago. Esther had always cherished it as a secret link to her mother's past. Hostein's breath caught. He reached out a trembling hand, his finger tracing the beaded design. A look of utter astonishment, of profound recognition, dawned on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but then seemed to think better of it. The questions in his eyes were vast and deep, but he withheld them. He spoke instead in a low, raspy voice, first in the melodic cadences of his own tongue, then in halting English. "The earth tried to take me," he said, his voice like stones rubbing together. You did not let it." "You were thirsty," Esther replied simply, as if that explained everything. He pushed himself to his feet, still unsteady. He was a man of great dignity, and even in his disheveled state, he stood tall. He gave her one last, long look, a look that held the weight of unspoken histories and unforeseen futures. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shimmering heat of the desert from which he had come. Esther watched him go, a strange sense of loss mixing with the relief. She was alone again, but the silence felt different now, charged with meaning. It was only then that she noticed the sun was high in the sky. She was hours late. The thought of Matron Shaw sent a jolt of real fear through her, colder and sharper than the fear she had felt at the edge of the quicksand. The fury that greeted her was biblical. Matron Shaw stood on the orphanage steps, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. The water buckets, which Esther had eventually remembered and filled, were ripped from her hands. "Where have you been, girl?" The matron's voice was a whip crack. "Look at you, filthy, wasting the day away while decent folk work." Esther, exhausted to her core, could not find the words to explain. An old man, quicksand, a life saved. The story sounded fantastical even in her own mind. It would sound like a lie, a wild and disrespectful fabrication to the matron. I fell," she stammered, offering a fragment of the truth. "In the arroyo." "Fell," Matron Shaw sneered, her disbelief a palpable force. She grabbed Esther's arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "You are muddy and you are late. You have been dawdling. Worse, you have been consorting with them. I can smell the wilderness on you." The filth of the savages. She had seen a distant rider from her window, and her mind, steeped in prejudice, had leaped to the worst conclusion. Esther's silence was taken as confession. The matron's rage escalated. This was not just about tardiness, it was about the defiance of her worldview, the crossing of a line she had drawn between her sterile, ordered domain and the wild, untamable world outside. An orphan girl under her charge had interacted with the very people she considered to be subhuman, a contamination of her authority. "You will learn obedience," the matron declared, her voice low and venomous. "You will learn that our ways are the only ways." The punishment was swift and severe. Esther was dragged not to her dormitory, but to the root cellar. The heavy wooden door, with its thick iron bolt, slammed shut behind her, plunging her into a world of damp, cloying darkness. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. A slice of stale bread and a tin cup of water were shoved through a slot in the door. "2 days of solitude to contemplate your wickedness," the matron's voice announced from the other side. "Perhaps God will see fit to cleanse your soul where I have failed." The bolt slid home with a deafening finality. Esther was utterly alone. The cellar became her world. The first day, she slept, her body succumbing to a bone-deep exhaustion she hadn't fully felt until now. The second day, time began to warp and stretch. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on her, and the silence was a roaring in her ears. She ran her fingers over the rough stone walls, tracing the damp mortar lines. She thought of Hostein, wondering if he was safe. The memory of his eyes, filled with that strange, intense recognition, was a single point of light in the suffocating blackness. She thought of her mother's book, left behind in her small dormitory chest, The fear that Matron Shaw might find and destroy it was a cold knot in her stomach. In the cellar, her act of kindness felt like a foolish mistake. It had brought her nothing but pain and punishment. The other girls, she knew, would be shunning her memory, whispering about her transgression, their fear of the matron stronger than any loyalty to a fellow orphan. She was more isolated than ever, not just physically confined, but excised from the only community she had ever known. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of this cold, dark hole, and the hope that had flickered within her during the rescue was all but extinguished, leaving only the familiar, bitter taste of despair. 5 days after she had pulled Hostine from the sand, the sun rose on a morning that felt different. A strange stillness had fallen over the small frontier town that huddled around the orphanage. The air was heavy, expectant. Inside St. Jude's, the morning routine was underway, but an undercurrent of tension ran beneath the clatter of bowls and the recitation of prayers. Matron Shaw seemed particularly agitated, her commands even sharper than usual. The arrival began not as a sound, but as a tremor in the earth, a faint, rhythmic vibration that grew steadily stronger. Then came the sound, the soft thunder of dozens of unshod ponies moving as one. The girls in the yard froze, their chores forgotten. Matron Shaw rushed to the gate, her face pale. A column of Navajo riders was approaching. They were not a war party. There were no raised weapons, no cries of aggression. They moved with a solemn, inexorable purpose, their faces proud and unreadable. They were led by a man younger than Hostine, with a warrior's build and the same dignified bearing. His name was Bidziel, and he was Hostine's son. His eyes scanned the orphanage, missing nothing. Among the riders, seated tall on a fine pinto, was Hostine himself, dressed in clean buckskins, his silver hair braided with strips of turquoise leather. They stopped 20 feet from the gate, a silent, imposing delegation that brought the town to a standstill. Windows and doors opened, faces peering out, a mixture of fear and awe gripping the onlookers. Matron Shaw, summoning her courage from a deep well of righteous indignation, stepped forward. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice tight but unwavering. "This is a house of God. You have no business here. Be gone." Bidziel dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He faced her, his height and presence making her seem small and brittle. "We are not here for you," he said, his English clear and measured, carrying the weight of authority. "We are here for a girl." The matron's face tightened. "Our girls do not consort with your kind. There is no one for you here." 5 days ago, Bidziel continued, his voice resonating in the charged silence, "my father was trapped in the sand of the dry river. He was dying. A girl from this place saved him. She had hair the color of sun-cured hay and eyes like the sky before a storm. She gave him water. She pulled him from the earth." A gasp went through the small crowd of orphans huddled behind the matron. They knew. They had heard the whispers, seen Esther's state when she returned. Matron Shaw's face went from pale to mottled red. She thought they were here for restitution, or worse, for revenge for some imagined slight. "Lies," she spat. "A fantasy. I will not have my charges slandered by such tales." Hostine urged his pony forward. He looked directly at the matron, his gaze piercing her wall of denial. "She wore a dress of grey," he said, his voice softer than his son's but no less powerful. "And on her sleeve was a sign, our sign." He held up his own wrist. Woven into a leather band was the same pattern Esther wore, the 4 triangles pointing to a central circle. "It is the mark of the Sky Watchers clan," Bidziel explained, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces. "A clan we thought had vanished 2 generations ago, when a daughter of our line, White Shell Woman, married an outsider and was lost to us." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. An old prophecy spoke of her return, not her, but her descendant. It said one would be found when our people were in need of a new voice, a new heart. This person would be marked by the sign, and they would prove their spirit not through battle, but through an act of selfless courage saving a life when they had nothing to gain. They would be Nata-Aniai, a leader, one who speaks for the people. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The townsfolk stared, their simple prejudices shattering against the rock of this ancient, profound belief. Matron Shaw's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The idea was too monstrous, too utterly subversive to her ordered world. An orphan, a filthy, disobedient girl, a queen. "We are not here to ask," Bidziel stated, his voice ringing with finality. "We are here to claim what is ours by blood and by destiny. We are here for Esther." At the sound of her name, a commotion came from the side of the building. The scullery maid, a timid girl named Martha, who had sometimes shared a crust of bread with Esther, had unbolted the cellar door. Esther emerged, blinking in the bright sunlight, her face pale and smudged with dirt, her frame thin from 2 days of near starvation. She was bewildered, drawn out by the strange silence and the sound of voices. She saw the riders, saw Hosteen, and then saw the look of pure, unadulterated horror on Matron Shaw's face. She heard the word the man had used, Nata-Aniai. She did not understand its meaning, but she understood the scene before her. On one side stood Matron Shaw and the world of grey walls, cold soup, and constant judgment. On the other stood a people she did not know, their faces stern but their eyes holding something she had never seen directed at her before: reverence. "There she is," Hosteen said, his voice filled with a quiet triumph. Matron Shaw turned on Esther, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Get back inside, you wretched girl, you are nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." But her words had lost their power. They were the desperate shrieks of a tyrant whose reign was ending. Esther looked at the matron, at the orphanage that had been her prison, and then she looked at Hosteen. She saw the man whose life she had saved. She saw Bidziel, who looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as a future to be embraced. Slowly, deliberately, Esther took a step forward, and then another. She walked past the sputtering, impotent matron, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. She did not know what a queen was, or what destiny awaited her. She only knew that she was walking away from a life of being nothing, and toward the slim, impossible chance of becoming someone. She stopped before Bidziel and Hosteen, raised her chin, and met their gaze. In the silence of the Arizona morning, she had made her choice. The departure was a quiet, solemn affair that left the town and Matron Shaw in stunned silence. There was no argument left to be made. Esther was allowed to retrieve her single possession, her mother's book of sketches. As she clutched it to her chest, she felt she was carrying her entire history with her into an unknown future. Bidziel helped her onto a gentle mare, his touch respectful and firm. As she looked back one last time at the grim facade of St. Jude's, she felt no sadness, only the release of a great and heavy chain. The journey into the heart of the Dine Bikea, the Navajo lands, was a revelation. The world bloomed from the muted tones of the orphanage into a vibrant tapestry of deep red canyons, soaring mesas, and a sky so vast and blue it felt like a benediction. The land was no longer a threat, a harsh expanse to be endured, but a living entity, beautiful and sacred. Her escort treated her not with fawning subservience, but with a quiet, profound respect that was more comforting than any luxury. They shared their food, pointed out landmarks, and spoke in their soft, musical language, including her in their circle of warmth. During a rest stop under the shade of a magnificent rock formation that looked like a slumbering giant, Hosteen sat with her. He unrolled an old, beautifully woven blanket. There, in the very center, was the pattern from her sleeve, the symbol of the Skywatchers clan. He told her the story of her great-grandmother, a weaver and a dreamer who had fallen in love with a surveyor from the east. When she left with him, the clan had grieved her as lost, but the matriarchs had kept the prophecy alive, a thread of hope woven through the generations. "You did not save only my life in the arroyo, little sister," Hosteen said, his eyes kind. "You saved a story from being forgotten. You brought the lost thread home." Her new life unfolded not in a palace of stone, but among the hogans and the grazing sheep under the endless sky. There was no throne, no crown. The title of Nataani was not one of command, but of counsel. It meant she was a person of wisdom and perspective, someone whose voice would be heard in the council, whose heart was trusted. Her innate resilience, once a survival mechanism, was now seen as strength. Her quiet, observant nature, once a fault, was now seen as wisdom. The knowledge from her mother's book, once a private escape, became a bridge as she learned the DNA names for the plants she knew, connecting her past to her present. She spent her days learning from Hosteen, from Bidziel, and from the clan's matriarchs. She learned to weave, her fingers slowly growing skilled at turning raw wool into patterns that told stories. She learned their language, their history, their ceremonies that honored the balance of the world. She was not a queen who ruled, but a vital part of a community that had made a place for her, a place that had been waiting for her all along. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the cliffs in hues of fire and rose, Esther stood at the edge of a mesa, looking out over the vast, breathtaking expanse. The wind that swept up from the canyon floor no longer howled with loneliness. It whispered stories of resilience, of belonging. She was no longer Esther, the orphan. She was Esther of the Skywatchers clan. The hollow ache in her chest, the one she had carried for as long as she could remember, was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound sense of peace. She had not been rescued to become a queen. She had been rescued to finally, truly, come home. The year was 1877, and the cold had a particular cruelty to it that autumn, a biting promise of the winter to come. For Cora, the cold was not just in the air that sliced through the threadbare wool of her shawl. It was a permanent resident in her bones, a deep chill that no fire could ever truly reach. She was a ghost in the raw, windswept town of Redemption, a place named for a hope it had long since forgotten how to offer. Her existence was a small, repeating loop of drudgery, rising before the sun to stoke the fires at the boarding house, hauling water until her shoulders screamed, and scrubbing other people's sins from their linens in tubs of steaming, lye-harsh water. She moved through her days in a shroud of silence, her face pale and still, her gaze fixed on the task at hand. The townspeople saw her but did not see her. She was simply the orphan girl, a piece of the town's grim furniture, arrived years ago on a wagon with a church group that had since moved on, leaving her in the care of a town that had none to give. Her parents were a faded memory, lost to fever on the trail west, their faces blurring into the vast, indifferent sky. Loneliness for Cora was not an emotion, it was the weather of her soul, a constant, grey overcast. She was 17, but the weight she carried in the slump of her shoulders belonged to a woman 4 times her age. Her home was a small, slanted room at the back of the laundry, a space that smelled perpetually of damp and soap. Its single window looked out onto a narrow alley where stray dogs fought over scraps. At night, she would lie on her thin straw mattress, listening to the wind howl across the plains, a sound like a thing grieving. It was a sound she understood. She had learned long ago that survival was a matter of making oneself as small and unnoticeable as possible, of expecting nothing, and therefore never being disappointed. Her heart was a locked room, the key long lost. Then the blizzard came. It did not arrive gently. It descended upon Redemption like a collapsing mountain, a furious, shrieking wall of white that swallowed the world whole. The sky vanished, the horizon dissolved, and the town was plunged into a churning chaos of snow and wind. People scrambled for shelter, doors were barred, and within an hour, the world beyond one's own 4 walls ceased to exist. Cora was caught just as she finished her work, sent out into the maelstrom by the laundry owner with a careless wave. "Hurry on home," the woman had said, as if Cora had a warm hearth waiting. The short walk to her room became a perilous journey. The wind tore at her, a physical force that sought to rip the breath from her lungs. Snow blinded her, stinging her cheeks like 1,000 tiny needles. She stumbled through the alley, one hand pressed against the rough-hewn wall of the general store, her only guide in the disorienting whiteness. It was then that she heard it, a sound so thin and fragile it was nearly lost in the gale's roar, a cry. She froze, thinking it was the wind, a trick of the ear, but it came again, a faint, mewling sound of pure distress. It was coming from a drift that had piled up against a stack of discarded crates. Logic, and the instinct for self-preservation she had honed for years, told her to keep moving, to get to her room, to block the door against the storm, but her feet would not obey. Something in that sound pierced the thick callus around her heart. She waded through the deepening snow, her skirts heavy and wet. There, tucked into a small hollow between the crates, was a cradleboard. It was intricately beaded, a work of art half buried in the snow, and strapped within its protective wooden frame was a baby. Its face was red with cold, its tiny lips tinged with blue. Its dark eyes were wide with a terror it was too young to understand. It was a native child, Lakota by the markings on the board, abandoned to the fury of the storm. For a long moment, Cora could only stare. She knew what the town thought of the Lakota. They were savages, a threat to be driven out, or worse, to be found with one of their children. It was a danger she could not afford. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to turn away, to pretend she had seen nothing. The storm would cover it. No one would ever know. It was the world's way. The world was a place of harsh, simple equations, and this child was on the wrong side of one. But as she looked at the infant, its chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate breaths, she did not see a savage. She saw a life as small and abandoned as her own had once been. She saw the same profound loneliness that echoed in the empty chambers of her own being. The wind howled its monstrous lullaby, and in its voice, Cora heard a demand. Not a choice, but a duty. With trembling, clumsy fingers, she unhooked the cradleboard from whatever it had been caught on, gathered the impossibly heavy burden into her arms, and turned her back on sense, on safety, on everything she knew. She carried the child into the storm, toward the fragile shelter of her room. The room was an icebox, the wind finding its way through a dozen cracks in the walls. The first thing Cora did was barricade the door, stuffing rags into the gap at the bottom. The world outside was gone, and now, inside this tiny, frozen space, there was only the storm, the crying child, and her own frantic fear. She unstrapped the baby from the cradleboard, her fingers numb and stiff. The infant's clothes were damp, its skin terrifyingly cold to the touch. Panic seized her. She had no milk, no proper food, no knowledge of how to care for a thing so fragile. The baby's cries grew weaker, a sound that twisted something in Cora's gut. She stripped off her own wet outer layers, down to her driest chemise, and then stripped the baby of its damp wrappings. Without a second thought, she pressed the cold, small body against her own skin, pulling her worn quilt over both of them. The initial shock of the child's coldness made her gasp, but she held on, wrapping her arms around it, trying to pour her own meager warmth into its failing form. The hours that followed blurred into a single, sustained moment of struggle. The blizzard raged, a relentless assault on the flimsy building. The room grew darker as the snow piled up against the small window, plunging them into a perpetual twilight. Cora lay on her mattress, the baby against her chest, listening to the rhythm of its breathing, a fragile counterpoint to the storm's fury. When the baby cried from hunger, she chewed a piece of her stale bread until it was a soft paste and nudged it into the corner of its mouth with her finger. It was a desperate, clumsy act of mothering, born of pure instinct. Days bled into one another. The world was reduced to the four walls of her room. The storm did not cease. It was a living entity, trying to claw its way inside. The greatest enemy, however, was the cold. It was insidious, creeping, and a draft snaked in from a gap near the window frame, blowing directly onto the makeshift bed. The baby, who she had started to think of as simply little one, would shiver violently whenever the draft touched its face. Cora shifted, trying to block the stream of frigid air with her own body, but it was persistent. She saw the baby's face, so small and vulnerable, its breath misting in the air. A fierce, unfamiliar feeling rose in her chest. It was a feeling that had a name, though she did not dare speak it: protection. Without conscious thought, she cupped her hands and held them over the baby's head, forming a small shield to deflect the icy current. Her right hand, then her left, creating a small pocket of still air around the child's face. She held the position for hours. At first, her hands just felt cold. Then they began to ache, a deep, painful throb that radiated up her arms. Then the ache gave way to a burning sensation, as if she were holding them over a fire. Finally, the burning faded into a profound numbness. She knew it was bad. She knew what happened to flesh that froze, had seen it on trappers and ranchers who had misjudged the winter, but she could not move. The baby had finally fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep against her chest, its breathing even and steady for the first time. That was all that mattered. The world had shrunk to that single, vital rhythm. In the dim, snow-filtered light, she looked down at her fingers. They were waxy and white, utterly devoid of feeling. She tried to flex them, but they would not respond. A distant, clinical part of her mind registered the damage, catalogued the future pain, the loss. But the rest of her, the part that was curled around this tiny, trusting life, felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, her existence was tied to something other than her own lonely survival. She had given a part of herself to keep another soul warm. The price was marked on her own flesh, a sacrifice made not for God or country, but for a nameless infant in a blizzard. And in that ruinous act, something inside her that had been frozen for years began, impossibly, to thaw. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, the silence was more deafening than the wind had been. Sunlight, brilliant and sharp off the new-fallen snow, sliced through a crack in the boarded window. It felt like an intrusion. The world was returning, and with it all its dangers. Cora's meager supply of bread was gone. The baby was weak but alive, nestled against her. Her hands were a horror. The numbness had been replaced by an agony so immense it made her vision swim. The fingers on her right hand, the two smallest ones, were no longer white. They were turning a dreadful, mottled shade of blue and black. The knock on the door came that afternoon. It was loud and commanding. Cora's heart leaped into her throat. She clutched the baby closer, a useless animal instinct. "Cora, open this door. We know you're in there." It was the voice of Mr. Hale, the town's self-appointed custodian of morality and owner of the general store. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet, her limbs stiff and protesting. She unbarred the door, her clumsy, swollen fingers barely able to work the latch. Hale stood there, flanked by the sheriff, a man named Donovan, whose face was a permanent mask of weary disapproval. Their eyes went from Cora's pale, defiant face to the bundle in her arms, and then to the cradleboard leaning against the wall. Hale's face curdled with disgust. "Sweet Mother of Mercy, it's true then. You brought a heathen savage into this town." "She's a baby," Cora whispered, her voice raw from disuse. "It's an Indian," Sheriff Donovan corrected, his voice flat. "Where did you get it?" "I found her, in the storm." Cora's own voice sounded foreign to her, stronger than she expected. She would have died. "Maybe that's God's will." Hale snapped, his piety a weapon. "You have no right. That thing is not your concern. It's a danger to us all. The tribe will come looking for it, and there'll be trouble." Whispers had already spread through the town like a contagion. A small crowd was gathering behind the two men, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They stared at Cora as if she had grown a second head. She had crossed a line, broken an unwritten rule more sacred than any law. She had chosen the other side. "You'll give the child to me," the sheriff said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll handle it." "Handle it." The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. "What does that mean?" Donovan's gaze was cold. "That's not your concern, girl. Now hand it over." He took a step forward. Cora took a step back, pressing the baby so tightly against her chest it let out a small whimper. "No." A gasp went through the small crowd. The orphan girl, the silent, invisible girl, was saying no to the sheriff. Hale's face flushed with anger. "You defiant little whelp. After this town has sheltered you, you bring this filth into our midst and defy the law." The pain in her hand flared, white-hot and blinding. An involuntary cry escaped her lips, and she swayed. Sheriff Donovan noticed her hand for the first time. "What, in God's name, happened to your fingers?" She cradled her injured hand with her good one, hiding it from their view. "It's nothing." "Nothing." Donovan's professional curiosity briefly overrode his purpose. "That's frostbite, and a bad case of it. You'll lose those fingers if they aren't seen to." "That's what happens when you consort with savages," Hale muttered piously. "It's a mark of her sin." The argument was cut short by a sudden shift in the crowd. A murmur of a different kind went through them, a sound of alarm. The people at the back began to move aside, parting like a reluctant sea. Into the space they cleared rode 5 figures on horseback. They were Lakota women, their faces etched with the gravity of their purpose. They were wrapped in thick buffalo robes, and they sat on their horses with an authority that made the sheriff and his bluster seem small and temporary. The town fell silent. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the soft snorting of the horses. The lead woman, her hair streaked with silver and her face a beautiful map of dignified endurance, dismounted. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded the space around her. Her dark eyes swept over the scene, taking in the hostile faces of the townspeople, the nervous sheriff, and finally, Cora. Her gaze lingered on Cora, on the tiny, dark-haired baby clutched in her arms, and then it dropped to Cora's ruined hand, which she was no longer trying to hide. The pain had made her careless, and the blackened fingers were in plain view. A younger man, who had ridden with the women, dismounted and stood beside the leader. He spoke to Sheriff Donovan in passable, if heavily accented English. "We are looking for a child, the daughter of Swift Deer, who was lost in the great snow." "The child is here," Donovan said, gesturing stiffly toward Cora. "This girl found it. We were just arranging for its return." It was a blatant lie, but he said it with a straight face. The lead woman, whose name was Winona, ignored him. She continued to look only at Cora. She spoke in her own language, her voice low and melodic. The young man translated. "She asks how the child survived the storm, mother." Cora swallowed, her throat dry. I found her. I took her to my room. I kept her warm." Winona spoke again, her eyes never leaving Cora's face. The translator relayed the question. "She asks what happened to your hand." Cora looked down at her grotesque fingers, then back up at the Lakota woman. For the first time she did not feel shame, only a strange, sad acceptance. The wind was cold. It came through the wall. I had to keep it off her face. She didn't need to say more. Winona's stern expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of understanding that transcended language. She took a step closer, her gaze softening as she looked at the baby, who was now awake and staring back at her with wide, dark eyes. Then she looked back at Cora, at this pale, trembling white girl who stood defiant against her own people, who had maimed herself to protect a child that was not hers. She spoke a few quiet words to the other women. One of them, an older woman named Istas, with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, nodded slowly. Winona turned back to the translator. Her next words fell into the stunned silence of the alley. "We have come for the child," the translator said, his voice resonating with the woman's authority. "The child is our blood. We will take her." He paused, and Winona took another step until she was standing directly in front of Cora. She reached out, not for the baby, but with a weathered hand, and gently touched Cora's shoulder. "But we will not leave the one who shielded her. Your sacrifice has marked you. Your heart is not the heart of these people. You have the heart of a Lakota mother. You have paid in flesh for this child. You are now kin. You will come with us." A collective shock rolled through the onlookers. Hale's jaw dropped. Sheriff Donovan looked utterly bewildered, his simple world of black and white and rigid lines suddenly thrown into chaos. He had expected a fight or a tense negotiation, not this adoption. "Now, hold on," Donovan started, finding his voice. "You can't just take her, she's one of us." Winona looked at him for the first time, and her gaze was filled with a pity so profound it was more insulting than any threat. The translator spoke her words. "She was never one of you. You saw an orphan to be used, a mouth to feed. You did not see her heart. We do. The choice is hers." All eyes turned to Cora. The world had split into two paths. Behind her was redemption, the town that had given her nothing but scorn and labor, the people who saw her as a sinner, a place where she would forever be an outcast, now even more so. Ahead of her were the strangers, the people she had been taught to fear, who were offering her something she had not dared to dream of for years, a place to belong. She looked down at the baby in her arms, this tiny being for whom she had sacrificed a part of her own body. She looked at her blackened, dead fingers, the price of that bond. And then she looked into Winona's steady, waiting eyes. Her decision was not made with logic. It was made with the deepest, truest part of her, the part that had been reawakened in the heart of the blizzard. She took a single shaky step forward, away from the sheriff and toward Winona. It was all the answer that was needed. One of the other women dismounted and gently took the baby from Cora's arms, murmuring soft, comforting words to it in their language. Winona put a firm, supportive arm around Cora's waist, taking her weight as she swayed, exhausted and overwhelmed by the pain. "You are safe now, daughter," she said in Lakota, and though Cora did not understand the words, she understood the tone. It was the sound of coming home. The journey to the Lakota winter camp was a dreamlike haze of pain and exhaustion. Cora rode on a horse led by Istas, wrapped in a thick, warm buffalo robe that smelled of wood smoke and sage. The world of redemption, with its narrow streets and narrower minds, vanished behind them, swallowed by the vast, white plains. The pain in her hand was a constant, searing fire, but every time a sob threatened to break from her, Winona would ride close, her presence a silent, steadying comfort. Their arrival at the camp was quiet and solemn. It was a collection of tipis nestled in a river valley, sheltered from the wind. Smoke rose from their peaks, a welcome sign of life and warmth. Cora was led immediately to a lodge set apart from the others, a healing lodge. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of herbs. The days that followed were a trial of fire and healing. The tribe's medicine man, a quiet elder named Kuruk, examined her hand with gentle, knowing fingers. There was no discussion, no false hope. The two fingers were dead. They had to be removed before the poison spread. The procedure was swift and brutal, performed with a sharpened obsidian knife and a searing brand to close the wounds. Cora screamed until her throat was raw, her body held down by the firm, compassionate hands of Winona and Istas. They did not leave her side. They bathed her sweat-soaked forehead, forced sips of a bitter, pain-dulling tea between her lips, and murmured to her in their soft, flowing tongue. In the long, slow weeks of her recovery, they cared for her with a tenderness she had never known. They brought her broth and stew, spooning it into her mouth when she was too weak to lift her head. They changed the herbal poultices on her hand, their touch always gentle. They spoke to her constantly, not demanding a response, but simply filling the silence with the rhythm of their language, weaving her into the sound of their lives. The baby, who she learned was named Chaitan, meaning falcon, was her most frequent visitor. His mother, Swift Deer, a young woman with haunted eyes, had died in the storm, thrown from her horse while fleeing a threat they did not explain. The women of the council were now his mothers, and by their decree, so was Cora. They would bring him to her, laying him beside her on the sleeping furs. He would watch her with his dark, intelligent eyes, sometimes reaching out with a tiny hand to touch her bandaged one, his touch impossibly soft. As her body healed, so did something deeper. The gnawing loneliness that had been her constant companion began to recede. It was replaced by a quiet sense of connection, a feeling of being woven into a fabric larger than herself. She was no longer Cora, the orphan. Here she was Ina Wanji, one mother, or Nape Sa, the one with the red hand. The names were given with respect, telling the story of her sacrifice. Learning their way of life was not easy. The language was a complex tapestry of sounds she struggled to weave with her own tongue. The work was hard, scraping hides, gathering wood, grinding corn, but it was shared. No one labored alone. The laughter of the children, the murmur of the elders telling stories by the fire, the shared meal sit was a community of breath and blood and spirit, and they had made a place in it for her. Months passed. The snow melted, giving way to the tender green of spring. Cora's hand healed into a permanent, scarred reminder of her journey. The two missing fingers were a phantom limb, aching with memory, but the sight of her own altered hand no longer filled her with horror. It was a part of her story, a testament to the choice that had saved not only Chaitan's life, but her own. She learned to cook, to sew, to work with 1.5 hands, her movements becoming fluid and certain. One bright afternoon in the late summer of 1878, she sat outside the teepee she now shared with Istus. The sun was warm on her face. A short distance away, Chaitan, now a sturdy toddler, was taking his first wobbly steps. He stumbled and fell onto the soft grass, looking up at her with a comical expression of surprise. He did not cry. Instead, he pushed himself up, a look of fierce determination on his little face, and took another step, then another, his arms outstretched for balance. Winona came and sat beside Cora, her comfortable silence a language all its own. They watched the boy together, his small, triumphant journey across the grass. He finally reached Cora, tumbling into her lap with a happy gurgle. She wrapped her arms around him, her scarred hand resting gently on his back. The feeling of his small, warm body against hers filled the last empty spaces inside her. "He has your spirit," Winona said softly in Lakota. Cora understood her now, her ear long since attuned to the music of the language. "He does not give up." Cora looked down at Chaitan, then at her own hand, the visible proof of her transformation. She had lost a part of herself in the heart of that blizzard, but she had gained a universe. She had found that home was not a building or a town, but the shelter two souls could provide for each other. Here, among a people she had been taught to hate, she had found family. Here, in the shadow of her own sacrifice, she had finally, truly, been redeemed. The wind that blew across the plains no longer sounded like a thing grieving. It sounded like a song.